Hey everyone, so this is a video on the Battle of Maldon. It was a battle that happened in England between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, and I'm going to talk about the history of it, some of the aspects of Anglo-Saxon warrior culture, and we're going to look at some excerpts from the Old English poem. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it really encapsulates the idea of Anglo-Saxon warrior culture. So if you're going to be reading Beowulf, this is a really good place to start because it will help you understand some of the things that are taking place in that poem. So we're going to talk about specifically COMITATUS, and I'll explain that, OFERMODE, and the meaning of Thane. So first of all, let's talk about Anglo-Saxon warrior culture. There were very few large armies back then, but there was a lot of small groups of warriors, and they were led by an earl or a chieftain or a lord. And this man was a powerful warrior, and he was known as a ring giver. He would give treasure to his men. And if anyone's read Lord of the Rings or watched the movies, J.R.R. Tolkien was an Old English professor, so there's a lot of this stuff that pops up in it. So when you study this, it's pretty interesting to see the parallels. But the chieftain was known as the ring giver, and his servants were warriors. They were called retainers or thanes. In Old English, thane. It sounds the same, but it's obviously spelled differently. And they owed him their allegiance. And this band of warriors was called comitatus. The Anglo-Saxon warrior thanes were loyal to their lord personally. They didn't fight for ideas or values as soldiers often do today. Instead, to die next to one's lord in battle was the highest honor a man could achieve. So it wasn't like what we're used to seeing in the movies where the king tells people what to do and then they just have to do it. It was actually more of an equal relationship, and at any point if the earl or the lord wasn't winning battles for people, they could just give up on him and elect a new person. So it was almost democratic in a way, but there was a lot of personal loyalty between a soldier and his lord. And theirs was a culture of vengeance. So Anglo-Saxon culture, it was very much eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If wrongs were done to a man, they were repaid in blood, or through what was called the man price. It was the weregild. So if someone killed someone else or beat someone up or whatever it was, they could either choose to pay a price or they could pay that price in blood. So it was a very ruthless culture, but it was actually very effective. And great deeds were preceded by boasting. This is very important, and it's big in Beowulf. You'll see it before Beowulf goes out to find Grendel. There's a lot of boasting that happens, and boasting is really just declarations of bravery and skill, and you had to be really good at this if you wanted to be in charge. Warriors invested confidence in their earl through his boasting. If he wasn't a good boaster, he wasn't a good leader. So let's talk about the Battle of Maldon. The battle occurred in 991 when a group of Scandinavian raiders met the English defense forces under the Anglo-Saxon Earl of Essex, whose name was BIRHTNOTH'S, at the estuary of the Blackwater River. And BIRHTNOTH, that's a tough name to say, isn't it? BIRHTNOTH led a small group of militia. It was just a home guard made up of inexperienced farmers and laborers, along with a small group of aristocrats, which was the comitatus, who were trained in the heroic martial tradition. And the poem recounts the battle, and it's an incomplete 325-line fragment. The manuscript actually survived the same fire that damaged the original Beowulf manuscript. And the poem, as I said before, exemplifies the depth of Anglo-Saxon warrior bravery, and I think anyway, encapsulates the very essence of comitatus. So let's talk about it. The beginning. The poem opens at the estuary of the Blackwater with the Anglo-Saxon forces drawing up on one side and the Vikings on the other. And I'm going to give you some lines from the poem, and where appropriate I'm going to give it to you in Old English, but I don't want to tire you with too much Old English, so most of this is going to be translations. So it starts out, "Then it was that Offa's kinsmen first perceived that the earl," who was BIRHTNOTH, "would not endure cowardice, for he let then from his hand flee his beloved falcon towards the woods, and there to battle went forth." So at the beginning of the battle, the earl has his favorite falcon, and he's almost certain that he's not going to survive, so he lets his favorite falcon fly off towards the woods. And this really just sort of shows his courage in the face of almost certain death. A few lines later it says, "Eadric desired to serve his chief, his lord to fight with, and so he advanced forward his spear to battle. He had a dauntless spirit as long as he with hands might be able to grasp shield and broadsword. The vow he would carry out that he had made before his lord, saying he would fight." So this is a very important part of Anglo-Saxon culture. They would swear allegiance to each other, and they would make vows. They would make vows before the battle that they would fight together and that they wouldn't abandon each other. Next part. Then BIRHTNOTH marshaled his soldiers, riding and instructing, directing his warriors how they should stand and the positions they should keep, and ordering that their shields properly stand firm with steady hands and be not afraid. Then when he beheld that people in suitable array, he dismounted amid his people, where he was most pleased to be, there amid his retainers, knowing their devotion. So I think this part of the poem really explains, or again encapsulates, this whole idea of a lord and his retainers. Where does BIRHTNOTH want to be? He wants to be in the fray with his men. He doesn't want to lead from behind. So what happens? Well, the Vikings are on the other side, and they make an offer. They say to him, I send to you from the bold seamen a command to tell you that you must quickly send treasures to us, and it would be better to you if with tribute buy off this conflict of spears than with us a bitter battle share. No need to slaughter each other if you would be generous with us. We would be willing for gold to bring a truce. So the Vikings are looking across at the Anglo-Saxons drawn up, and they basically say, look, we'll go away if you pay us. Give a tribute. And that was a very common part of that time. People would pay tributes to the Vikings to basically make them leave them alone. But BIRHTNOTH replies, to us it would be shameful that you with our coin to your ships should get away without a fight. Now you thus far into our homeland have come. You shall not so easily carry off our treasure. With us must spear and blade first decide the terms. Fierce conflict is the tribute we will hand over. So it sounds almost like the movie 300, doesn't it? But that's sort of that whole thing about not backing down, that machismo, that was very much central to Anglo-Saxon culture. So here's the problem. Because of the narrow land bridge that existed between the two sides, only a few men were able to cross at once, and that left them open to arrow fire. So the poem says, because of the river they were not able, this band of men, to fight the other. There came flowing the flood after the tide, joining in the tidal stream. Too long it seemed to him until the time when they together with spears join in battle. There they on the pant stream with pride lined the banks, East Saxon spears and the sea raider army, nor might any harm the other unless through an arrow's flight death receive. So here's basically, if I can break it down for you, what it looked like. You had the estuary of the Blackwater. On the one side you had the Anglo-Saxons and BIRHTNOTH, and on the other side you had the raiders, which was the Vikings, and they had set up camp over there, and they were crossing this area to go on raids. But when the tide would come in, you couldn't get across, and it was only when the tide would go out a little bit that there was this small land bridge. So here's basically the problem. The Vikings needed to cross one at a time, or nearly one at a time. It was such a narrow piece of land. But when they did this, they exposed themselves to arrow fire. So it became apparent very quickly that they had basically fought themselves to a stalemate. So then we come to BIRHTNOTH'S OFERMODE. And this is really an example of pride goeth before destruction. And BIRHTNOTH would have probably been aware of that verse also. So in the poem it says, Aelfr and Maccas, too great in courage, who would not at this fjord take to flight, but stoutly against the enemy defended themselves, while with their weapons they might wield. Then they understood and clearly saw that this guardian of the causeway was a fierce encounter, and so began to use guile, the hateful strangers, meaning the Vikings, asked that passage to land they might have, to the shore, and pass the fjord with this force lead. By the way, notice the strange construction. It's because of its translations. And then the poem goes on to say, then the Earl permitted in his great pride to allow land many of these hateful people. So in Old English, it sounds like this. These ongen for his OFERMODE, alfen lande te fale la theri theode. So in other words, that's that idea of OFERMODE, and OFERMODE translates literally as over spirit. Mode means mind, body, mind or spirit, but it's a spirit that's contained within the body. And ofer means over or across. So OFERMODE is basically over spirit. And this was central to Anglo-Saxon culture, but as you'll see in the battle, it becomes a problem for BIRHTNOTH, and he's remembered for this OFERMODE, this thing that he does. So what does he do? Basically the Vikings say, look, let us come over and we'll line up and we can fight. And what BIRHTNOTH probably should have done is said, whatever, I'm just going to keep shooting you guys with arrows. But instead he said, all right, come on over. I can beat you anyway. So basically what happened was BIRHTNOTH pulled his men back, and he allowed the Vikings to cross. And they lined up for battle, And it may seem stupid, but you have to realize that this is really indicative of Anglo-Saxon culture. He didn't want to have that kind of advantage. He wanted to fight them on equal ground. So then we get into some of the beauty of the poem, and once the Vikings line up, the poem explains the battle, and there's lots of really beautiful passages about some courage and some cowardice. So I want to share some of them with you. One of them is when BIRHTNOTH dies. He's killed almost immediately, and it says, "Then he was slain by the heathen warriors, and both of those warriors which by him stood, Ælfnoth and Wulmer, were each slain. Close by their lord did they give up their lives." So notice that construction, close by their lord. They died next to him. But then there was a coward among them, Godric. And it says, "Godric fled from the battle, and the noble abandoned the one which had often given him many a horse." So in other words, he betrays the trust of BIRHTNOTH, because BIRHTNOTH had given him things. He had been the ring giver, and Godric fled anyway. It goes on, "He leapt upon the mount of the steed which had once been his lord." So he actually takes BIRHTNOTH's horse. "On those trappings of which he was not fit. He and with his brothers both galloped away." And Godric is condemned throughout all of Anglo-Saxon literature for this act of cowardice. And then another part, "Thus had Offa on that day first said at the meeting place, there at the council, that there would be boldly many a boastful speech, which at the time of stress would not endure." So when Godric flees, they basically say, this is it. It's easy to say that you're going to fight by your lord, but when the rubber meets the road, not everyone will do it. And so then we see lots of examples of COMITATUS and BIRHTNOTH'S thanes, and here's some examples of that. "But then there advanced onward those splendid retainers, undaunted men hastening eagerly. They desired all one of two things, to leave life, or else to avenge their dear lord. Æthelwine then said, he in valiant talk, Remember the speeches which we had often at mead spoken, that we on the bench had loudly uttered vows, warriors in the hall, concerning bitter strife. Now may we prove who is truly valiant. And then Offa says, I swear that from here I will not flee a foot's space, as my desire is to advance further, avenge in battle strife my lord and friend. Wrathfully he advanced, fighting resolutely, for he despised flight. And again, the poetry of revenge. Here's a much longer section, but I really think it's beautiful. Dunor then said, brandishing his spear, a simple yeoman calling out to the entire shore, exhorting that each warrior avenge BIRHTNOTH. One cannot retreat who intends vengeance for our lord of the host, if their lives they care not for. So then they pressed forward, caring not about their lives. Then began these retainers to fiercely fight, ferocious warriors armed with spears, and praying to God that they might avenge their lord and patron, and on their enemy death make. So did Ethric, noble comrade, press forward, and eager to advance fight resolutely. Siegbert's brother, and very many others, splitting the enemy's shields. Valiantly they defended themselves, rang the shield rims, and sang the corslets of mail, a certain terrible dirge. And there's a part shortly thereafter where it says, Gar oft therwood fees fairhus, which means then often the spear pierced the doomed houses of life. So in other words, the body, being the doomed house of life, is being pierced by spears. So it's total slaughter. And then, this is the cost of OFERMODE. BIRHTNOTH is actually buried at the cathedral at Ely, or Ely, I'm not sure, in Cambridgeshire. And although his bones are there, his head is missing. So obviously the Vikings had something to do with his body afterwards. And his tomb is the one on the far right. Closer there it says, BIRHTNOTH, Duke of Northumberland, killed in battle by the Danes 991 AD. You notice his name is spelled wrong, although I wouldn't say it's wrong. His spelling was not standardized back then like it is now. So that's where BIRHTNOTH is at now. And I hope that gives you some idea of Anglo-Saxon culture. If you're going to be reading Beowulf, then you'll start to see this kind of thing pop up a lot. It was a really, really difficult time to be alive. Those guys had to fight every single day, and they were hard men. But I have a lot of admiration for them, and I think it's really beautiful the way in which they fought for each other and the way in which they stuck together. And we see that sort of carrying on into our culture now, but in some ways it's something we've lost. So it's nice to be able to read back and reflect on where we come from. So I hope that was interesting. Thanks.